So in the green room before we got started, Andrew mentioned that he's a lover of C.S. Lewis's nonfiction work. And as the Leadership Council was reading this book together, one of the things we noticed was that the central theme of the book was quite reminiscent of C.S. Lewis's essay, Meditations in a Toolshed. So if you aren't familiar with that essay, Lewis distinguishes between the analytical mode of looking, which means you're looking at something from the outside, and the experiential mode, which looks along something from the inside. So what we'd like to ask about that is how his work influenced you as a literary artist, and perhaps how Lewis's writings influenced your spiritual life.
Well, right. Well, Lewis, it's really interesting. As I was growing up, Sigmund Freud kind of dominated the intellectual scene to a degree that it's very hard to convey to people today. It's very hard to explain to people how everything was seen through a Freudian lens. Movies that were made basically had this Freudian underpinning. If you've ever seen Alfred Hitchcock's film Psycho, it ends with this psychiatrist delivering this kind of ridiculous and yet authoritative explanation of everything we've seen. That was very common in drama of all sorts. Freud just dominated the world, and weirdly, my life was saved. I went through a very difficult period in my late 20s where I went insane, and my life was saved by an excellent psychiatrist who was to a degree a Freudian. And what happened to me was after I became sane again, and I now consider it a miracle. I've never met anybody who made the transition from as crazy as I was to as sane as I have become. I suddenly realized that everything we had talked about was untrue. And I started to ask myself, well, then how did he save me? And realized that it was the love between us. And so I started to read people who spoke into that kind of idea, the idea of the spirit. I was very interested in this because of my love for my wife, which was instantaneous on meeting her and has lasted unbroken for 42 years in a extraordinary marriage, a marriage that just isn't like most marriages. And so I knew that love was a real thing, talking about subjective. And when I got to C.S. Lewis, and it was Mere Christianity, it was the first book I read, I suddenly thought, oh, like here is the mind of the 20th century. Here is the person who was thinking the great thoughts, while Freud was really, Freud was a brilliant quack, but still a quack. And Lewis read Freud, understood Freud, knew what he was talking about, but understood him in a way that made sense in a broader context, the context of spiritual life. And so I knew right away on hitting C.S. Lewis that I was reading something extraordinary, and I got very into his. I'm not a fan of children's fiction anyway, so I wasn't a big fan of the Narnia books, but I was a big fan of his essays and his spiritual writings. And they led me to Owen Barfield, who very much was the Inklings, that group of Christian writers. Barfield was the smartest of that group. I think they all acknowledged that. I believe Mere Christianity is dedicated to Barfield, and Barfield informed a lot of the writings of Tolkien and Lewis. And Barfield was a great interpreter of the Romantics. So Lewis led me to Barfield. And those are life-changing books and have been a big part of my understanding that the Christian philosophy of life, the Christian experience of life, has not disappeared. It's been literally silenced. It's been literally covered over by materialist philosophy like Marxism and Freudianism. And this entire world of genius and understanding has been hidden away, I think, from the intellectuals of our day. You really can't get into a conversation with many intellectuals about God because they recoil. They physically recoil. I was just like that before I became religious. The word Jesus used to go down my back like someone had dropped a centipede down my shirt. I just would like that. Don't talk to me about that. And Lewis opened up an entire world of the intellect that I found much richer, much deeper, and ultimately more realistic than the words of guys like Freud and Marx.
Those are such fantastic insights. We have several here in the Society who do work in Lewis studies or in Inkling studies. And I think all of them probably learned something wonderful from the insights you just shared. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
Yeah, I do think that's part of what drew us to this book and made us hopeful we might be able to snag you for a salon, is it did resonate in that tradition. You do quote Barfield. You very much are writing in the tradition that Lewis and Tolkien and the Inklings preserved. And hopefully, there is signs of a renaissance. We'll have hope.